How are we all doing? Good? Yeah? All right. So just to quickly get an idea, we're just going to kind of get started really quickly because we don't want to run out of time and still get through everything that we've got in here. Who works within game audio? Cool. And programmers, artists, producers, people that don't work in games? Well, cool, welcome. And who has played The Forest? Yep. People that know of it but haven't played it, and who hasn't heard of The Forest before this talk? Cool. Okay. So hopefully we'll get a good idea of those things for you to come through, and again we'll go through at the end and we'll have our contact details up there. So like we'll talk about the talk early this morning. We want to be able to pass on knowledge and be able to help there, like within game audio as well. So we'll make sure they're up in the beginning. But to begin with, we just want to put up a content warning. We've tried to avoid violence as much as possible when it comes to the content that's in here, but because of the type of game that it is, there are a little bit of examples of violence, both graphically in terms of audio as well. And it's turned out that it's most of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But we'll show a trailer that has a little bit of violence in a little bit, and then later on there'll be a few examples where there is a little bit of violence. So just in case anyone's sensitive to that type of thing, there's absolutely no issue if you need to leave. So I just wanted to make sure that was a thing. So the first reason we want to go through is like why we want to do this. So we've been working on The Forest for quite a while now, and it's always something that I think I've felt that we really want to talk about in terms of what we've been doing on the project, how we've been going about the audio in the game, and the type of workflows that we've created both before we started working and things that came out of working on The Forest as well. So we want to go through the importance of setting design specifications and goals. We'll go through the benefits of early development inclusion of game audio and audio teams as well, which is The Forest was an early access title, and we benefited greatly from being included early into that project. So that's something we want to touch on as well. Demonstration of design workflow and audio tools. So Michael and I will both go through some examples of what we did on the game, and discuss challenges, which we'll go through. So I'll hand it over to Michael, and he'll have a little bit of a talk as well.
Hello. Yeah. So I'm Michael. This is Trevor. We didn't really introduce ourselves.
We didn't.
Yep.
Sorry.
We're 2/3 of Kpow Audio. The third member is Parrot von Sturmer, and he's based in Sydney. So we've been working in game audio for about 6 years now under Kpow, but before that we were on, Parrot and myself were working at Team Bondi on LA Noire. That's where we met, and after that formed the company. These are some of the games that we've worked on. Mirror's Edge, we just did a little bit of the audio logs in that, and Soma, we just helped out on data mines, black boxes, and a lot of the VO implementation. These are some of the awards that we've been nominated for and won, which we don't often get to brag about stuff, and this is a good opportunity too. So what is The Forest? The Forest is an open world game, but it's contained because it's set on an island. There's a couple of biomes. Your plane crashes on this island, and you find that it is populated by mutants, and you are tasked with surviving. That was the premise when we were brought on board. It evolved a fair bit, but that's basically the basics of the game. Cool. Here's the trailer. Sorry.
applauding me doing the lights.
Yeah, brilliant. Sorry it's so quiet. I don't know, we've got everything pumped up to full. So as you can see, the game is, although it's quite contained, there's a lot of variety in it, and the sounds that we have to create, hundreds of sounds are needed for this game. It's a pretty awesome opportunity. The music that you heard in the game is composed by Gabe, who does that kind of rock, heavy synth pop style perfectly. It's been really great to work with him. He's a lovely guy.
So just to give you a quick overview of the actual project itself. So it's on PC. As I said, it was an early access project. And it's coming out on PS4, I believe, 4th or the 6th of November. So it's currently going through certification stages at the moment. The team size kind of fluctuated depending on what was required and what was happening. It was about 12 to 15 people. And that included 3 of us that were working, so Michael and myself and Ben Butt, who did quite a lot of the audio programming and audio tools on the project. So it was early access, sold about over 5 million copies, so there's a pretty decent player base that's on there, which is kind of amazing and terrifying all at the same time. It was made in Unity, and for audio middleware we used Fmod on there as well. In terms of our input, what we did on the game, we did Foley recording, obviously sound design, and there's over 8,000 assets in the game. So it's one of those things, and we'll go through some details later why there's quite a few assets, but it was a pretty decent job. Lots of editing for the vocalizations for the mutants, which is the workflow that I'll go through. Audio programming, implementation, audio tools that we made, and again, that'll go into the benefits that we received from being included early into the project. And mixing for both PC and PlayStation 4 using the Sulfur suite that they've got for the PlayStation. So the first main thing that we want to go through, and I won't elaborate in this slide, but this is what we want to use our workflows to go through and to then break apart, is the importance of setting sound specifications for the job for us. So we first looked at specifying the requirements to make the game sound amazing. So this is the benefit of being included really early into a project, because you can actually sit there and you have the time to actually break these down and to see where that's going to guide the design, and then create design goals from there. So what's the core purpose of sound in the game? So it sounds like a really simple question, but that's going to change for every single game that you're going to work on, every single different genre of game, because sound's always going to serve a different purpose. What feelings should the soundscape create? So what does it need to do for the player? And given that the sound was so important to this game and the player and players will spend so long in this game, that became a really important question. And what textures are we working with? So what types of sounds, what kinds of samples or what kind of recordings do we need? No different to what artists or texture artists would look for when they're starting to kind of create mood boards and things like that when they're going through elements. And the tools and support required. So that was you for the next one. Sorry.
So the sound design goals, we tried to, this is not really our call, this was the devs' call, but they wanted minimal music, which was awesome for us, because the sound becomes way more important than if they want to slather music all over it. We wanted
against any composers in the room.
Oh, no. I've got something I could say about that. No, I will. So if you put music all through your game and you have a key moment that's really important that you want to hit really hard, and you have this amazing track that you use for that moment, because there's been music all the way through, you hit that moment and no one cares because they're immune to it by that point. We wanted to design the environment for as a core character, which I'll be talking on more in a sec. The environment should respond to the player's movements and actions, something I'll talk about in a moment as well. The whole world should feel realistic, which means everything in it, if it moves or drops or hits something else, it needs to make a sound, which becomes a big job, but needs to happen. Sound should feel real, which was really important for this game. You want to be walking through and feel like you're in a real place, because then when the mutants appear, it's not... they're more scary when it feels more real. Yeah. And convey fear of the unknown. And then there's a whole underground system of caves, and that needed to have a very different feel to the above ground environments. It needed to feel a lot closer and claustrophobic. And there is multiplayer in this game as well, which again makes it exponentially more complicated, and we needed to communicate key things about the environment to and the health of each other and where everyone was in a multiplayer environment. And the main source of danger in the game comes from mutants, so they needed to be scary. Slide. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to talk through a bit of because the ambience for the whole world was so important. I've put together some of the things that we worked on in the ambient design. So we had streamed loops covering different biomes. That's pretty standard for most games. We have wind in trees, and because it's in a forest, it's called the forest, the actual trees become real. Well, the feel of being in a forest becomes really important, and it's really hard to do that with a stereo environment, because you want each tree to feel like it's its own thing, but there are hundreds of them, so they can't all play tree sounds at once. To make this work, we worked with Ben Batt on an algorithm that gave priority to trees based on your orientation, the speed you're moving, and whether a tree is being occluded by another tree, so then it would remove one of those sources. And this meant that you could be moving through a forest and you could feel like you were moving towards a sound source, whereas if we didn't have this system set up, you can get weird stealing between different emitters. You can be moving through and the emitter has already been used up for trees around you, so you don't get a sense that you're moving towards a tree. So that was a really cool bit of tech that we got in there that made a huge difference. Also, all of the trees have, I think, 3 or 4 different scatter sounds, which means that they're re-triggering a short kind of gentle fade in, fade out constantly, so that they're covering each other. And then that also has an intensity setting, which when the wind picks up makes it get more intense, moves through the different samples as you get more intense wind. And so the wind in the trees was quite a complex event, and it was triggered by quite a complex algorithm, which makes a huge difference to feeling like you're immersed in the forest. We also had wind through structures which had the same intensity. So as the wind picks up, there's like a hum, more like a hum loop through structures that you build. There's ritual statues that are like bone and limbs of fallen comrades. And these have a sound in the wind as well, so you get a sense that you're moving through a real organic place. Trees also have particles that scatter leaves, and we hooked up a sound. Well, it's not entirely hooked. like it's not in time, but all the trees scatter leaves, and for some reason when that's not there it feels a lot more lifeless, but when that's there it feels like you're in a living, breathing space, especially with these other elements that we've added, such as birds and animals. So these are all ambient creatures that just walk around as you're walking through, and they'll, when they get alarmed, they'll let a little cry. Otherwise, you just hear their footsteps if they don't notice you there. And they do have ambient communication as well, so it feels like they're talking to each other, but they're not. Yeah, so footsteps. And this helps to bring the world to life. Without all of this, without all these layers, it would feel a lot more like you just get that stereo loop. But when you start bringing in point source emitters into the ambient world, it starts to feel a lot more alive. We also have rain, which consisted of two parts. Because there's a lot of water in the world, the rain, it's just a stereo loop of... and actually it did have an intensity layer as well, so when the wind got stronger it would get more sharp, but it's just a rain on foliage sound basically. But then when you're in water there's a scatterer, and a scatterer is basically lots of individual sounds all getting triggered one at a time. And I've spread this around the player when they're on water, so you get the plops all around you when it's raining, which works really well. Oh yeah, and there's also trickling down inclines, and the steeper the angle, the higher pitch and slightly louder I made it. You hear the leaves dropping. So it's a bit soft, hard to hear, but all these elements start to add up and give a sense of a living, breathing world. So then, because there's a daytime and a nighttime cycle, then we've got a similar thing happening at nighttime that sort of mirrors the daytime sounds. And we've also got a whole new slew of samples that come in just at nighttime to kind of freak people out, basically. So it's distant animals, and all of these animals, they're in the world, well, except for elk, they're in the world during the day, but you don't really hear them that much. I mean, you hear them a little bit, but not much. But at nighttime, all of the sounds that they emit are realistic, but they sound terrifying. Like deer are freaky, elk are, they're all just, but they're realistic sounds. And then we've also got the mutants. When they're in the distance, you can sort of hear them. With time of day, we've got, so there's birds that are scattered throughout the world and they have their own individual emitters. And also there's ambient loops that have birds in them. And they change so that I think at midday I kind of make them a bit quieter, and then in the mornings they're louder, and at nights they disappear and we get bats and that sort of thing instead. So there's a whole day-night cycle going on. Oh yeah, and then those same leaves that are falling during the daytime, at nighttime, they're the same leaves falling, but they take on a completely different quality because you can't see anything, basically, because you're relying on sound rather than your sight. Those leaves feel like a creature is just around the corner, or something's going on, but you don't know what. Yeah, so because it's dark, your sense of hearing gets heightened, and it becomes even more important.
Is there a way we can push the volume up at all on this? Because it's really, really low. There was wind and insects in that section. I promise you it was that.
Yeah. So finally, with the ambient world, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the tech that we had going on. So I talked about the tree emitter algorithm already. That was really cool. We had, because you can build your own structures, and there's a whole lot of preset structures that you can build, but you can also build custom structures. So you could put a wall here and a wall here and a wall here and a wall here, and then suddenly you'd be surrounded by walls. And we wanted to feel like the outside ambience isn't coming in, so we wanted to occlude that somehow. But because it was a custom structure, we basically did ray casting at the walls, but we needed to make that really cheap, so it doesn't happen too often. The cools don't happen too often. But basically it means that you can do really complex structures around yourself, and still the occlusion system would work. And that was pretty rad. And we had linear emitters for streams and waterfalls, which I'll show you a video of in a moment. But basically, usually the tricky thing, we had it on rivers as well, and the tricky thing with having emitters on rivers usually is that you would be fading between emitter locations, or you could have one, basically the solution that we came up with was have splines, and the emitter slides along the spline based on distance. But then if you've got a river that goes like this and you're standing in the middle and you're walking backwards and forwards slightly, then it's going to be jumping between two. And we got around that by having two emitters always per river next to you. So you don't always need them, but when you're in that instance, it means that you can have two. We don't care. Like it's only one other emitter, and it solves that problem. And we had them on waterfalls and around streams. Did we do lakes? We had some weird shaped lakes as well.
Shorelines for like the beach and the sandbanks as well.
Yeah.
From an implementation point of view, it just made it really, really easy because we could basically just follow the path of where we needed it to go. Add in nodes, and you could like bend it and curve it around it, so you could follow the natural shape of the geography in the game, which made it a lot easier. And it literally would take 3 minutes, 5 minutes to get the sounds in there for the waterfall, and then just test that it works, and you're good to go. Which was again another example of having the time to build tools to allow us to do those things.
And having Ben Bat on the team
was good.
Ben Bat was previously, or actually he was still working at FMod at the time, and we were using F1 Studio, so it was pretty awesome. So this is a waterfall emitter. See how it's moving smoothly up as you go up, staying next to you? That's where the emitter position actually is in the world.
Okay. And now this is where I get to talk about gory stuff. So, and that video there with the emitter, I'm ashamed to admit it took me about 5 goes to get that without walking into the rock. So it was horrible. All right, so one of the things I'm building up, and the reason why I wanted to talk about the environmental elements first and the ambience is that bringing in the mutants to that creates this dissonance. And I think that's because it sounds so natural in the environment, and we went for a really realistic soundscape for it, bringing in the mutants and the way that their vocalizations are either emitted when you do see them or when you're not seeing them, and if it's at daytime or at nighttime. That's where the horror comes from for me in this game. And I know there's been times where I've been working on the game, testing something in the environment, and the mutants come running in and scared the absolute shit out of me. And I know that people, one of the common things that we get back is either people are terrified of the caves, or they're terrified of the mutants basically grouping up on them or approaching them for the first time. So kind of just wanted to go into a little bit about that. So in terms of the sound design goals for the mutants, again, we wanted that to be the source of tension and fear. So there was quite a lot of mutant assets in there in terms of like the types, the characters. So we wanted to replicate that with the vocalizations. We wanted them to be heard when not visible. So again, at nighttime, your visibility is like really, really reduced. And we wanted to kind of play on that as well, which again is where a lot of the horror comes from in the game. And also provide warnings to the player. So if they're doing something or if they're out trying to scavenge something and they're away from like a safe house, if they hear something in the distance, then a lot of the time you run pretty quickly back to where it's safe, or you try and react to that in a defensive type of way. And to add and to emphasize mutant animations. So again, any type of vocalizations for characters, it's always going to be adding like a higher level of polish to an animation. And I know like this game would feel really, really weird if the mutants didn't have that type of personality when you're actually playing through it. Why is it doing that? All right. So in terms of VO performance and selection, so basically what happened is the actors and the voice actors and the vocalizations were recorded at a different studio, and we were given the source files to sit through and to edit. So basically the first main job was performance selection. So mapping up the vocalizations with the animations that we wanted to have vocalizations on. And that was a pretty big job, and I think it's also a really important job because you don't want that. That can really, really break a game if it doesn't look natural when a vocalization comes out and it's not matching the animation or it's not mapped up to the action that the mutant is actually doing in the game. So you look for a constant performance as well. So you might have a group of, like, might be like so when mutants see the player from a distance, they'll do like these screams or these groans. So you want lots of variations of them, but you also want them to kind of have a similar meaning as well. So it's kind of about finding that right balance. Provide variation, provide a general mood as well. So there's some examples where they may see you and they might just stand there looking at you and groaning at you. So they're not actually attacking, they're just kind of creeping you out. So that provides a different mood compared to when they're running at you and they're like screaming and charging at you. So again, gives the player a little bit of information both in terms of audio feedback and visual feedback as to what may be happening. And I mean, it's pretty obvious if a mutant's running at you, what's going to happen. And marking preferred performances was a big one. So I think with this, I think for the most part, there's over 2,000 vocal performances in the game for it. So when you're going through, and I'll go into that area, when you're going through and editing that, you want to automize the elements that you're working on as much as possible in terms of how you're editing them and in the next step, how you're rendering them as well. So here's where I do the game audio thing and I talk about Reaper. So, so I started doing a lot of the editing in Logic and then eventually moved over to Reaper, which for editing was an amazing discovery. And like, it's one of those things where it was informed by how I went about my work and how I could then set up tools. So using things like the render matrix in Reaper, which allows you to basically set up these massive batches of assets. And you can set them all with a similar naming convention, which is basically what you're seeing there, and get it to increment the file count And what that'll do is if you have mutant site play a scream, and that will, if you have, say, 100 of those, it will automatically render them out and keep the same file name and just increment the file number or the name count at the end. And that saves so much time. And using the label processor and then creating regions by the label, which is what you're seeing there. So each one of those will get rendered out as a separate asset. And I cannot tell you how much time that will save you. So that's a really good thing. And again, I won't go through it in specifics here, but if you want to talk about that kind of thing later on, I'm free to have a chat about that stuff because it saves lots of time. So in terms of how those assets work, so we've rendered out the assets, and then we needed to figure out, because there's different types of mutants, how we're going to call them and how we're going to call the different types that are in there as well. So essentially what happens is you have the animation event, and then that will go down and that will basically talk to the prefab that is the mutant character that's been instantiated into the game world. And that will figure out the type of mutant that it is, and then it will basically assign it an actor class. And then those parameters will get pushed through to Fmod, and then that will basically play the sound file that's associated with that animation, with that mutant type, and with that actor. And the way that we went about doing it that way is we could keep a pretty logical flow of information. So we could figure out what was happening if something was going wrong. And it allowed us to kind of set up a pretty easy to follow work path in Fmod as well. Such an example of how it's getting called in code. So you can see there, you're calling the type, and there's all the different types of mutants that'll grab the float, and then it'll pass that through to Fmod, and same with the actor element that you've got there, and that'll basically talk to Fmod. Now, I'm going to try and alt-tab to Fmod, so anything could go wrong. Wrong screen. Oh no. Wait, how's that work?
Can you just tell it to use the laptop screen here?
Nope. Nope. Let me try clues. Okay, should probably skip on. I can show you that later on the laptop. So basically, all it is we've basically got a main parent event. And then what happens under those parent events is we've got all of the different Fmod events for the different mutant types. And basically we've got them all. So if you think of a timeline, we've got all of the different types on a single timeline, and they then replicate what those numbers are on the float. So whenever it pushes through and it goes, okay, the mutant has seen the player and they want to emit like a groan, or they want to emit a scream, that'll then find the actor type. And like I said before, it'll push it all through to Fmod. And if that had worked, I would have shown you an example of that. But technology is obviously not our friend today. It would have been ironic if it came up then. All right. Now, just to give you an example of that in-game. So when it's at night time, it's horrible in that game. And again, I can't even remember how many times that I've been, like I was saying, I might be working a peaceful waterfall sound in the game, and then just having a mutant coming running at me out of nowhere, and it's horrible. but it creates a cool effect, and especially when it comes to the difference between daytime and nighttime. I know even I've put like something like 1,000 hours or something into the game on Steam, like obviously from working on it. But even I don't like playing at nighttime, like when I'm playing this game. So it does make a big difference. So in terms of development tools, and this is the kind of thing where I really want to reinforce how incredibly important it can be to introduce audio into a game early. So that doesn't mean designing assets early, but just talking to people involved in audio that are on the team, or thinking about the potential tools that you may need for things that you're going to be doing over and over and over again. And they may exist within middleware. It may be something that you can get for Unity, but it's no different to any other discipline in games. Like if you can make someone's job easier, you're going to make it easier, you're going to save time, and you are going to benefit from it. And I think that's something that the Forest really did benefit from. So again, you will save money and you will save time eventually, especially if it's a long development cycle, which the Forest was. We had a tool, a general debug tool that was incredibly useful, which we could do things like setting God mode, so we didn't have to worry about those mutants coming up to us. We could spawn mutants in game world, so if we were testing a particular type of mutant, we could just say spawn, type in their name, and it would spawn at the player's position that we had in there. We had a go-to tool, that was really hard to say, where what we could do is we could type in either a game object name, or we could type in a location. Like there's an area called Geese Lake, which is like a real peaceful area. It's like a lake and everything, and we could type in go to Geese Lake, and wherever we are in the game world, that will find that object, it will find its location, it will basically transport the player directly to that point. So that was really, really useful, given it's quite a big open map. If we were needing to test things, we could just basically start playing Unity, type where we wanted to go, and it saved us from having to find the player character, move the player character. So it was a really quick and efficient tool that we had in there. And another one was the component search tool, which essentially what that allowed us to do is, like the game, the project quite big, and the things like, say for the weapon systems, we have like a hierarchy of impact types when it comes to, you might have the original axe that you find, and if you hit, say, a wood type, it'll trigger a wood material. If you hit metal, it'll hit a metal material. And we had all of these different components, and we knew what script things we're using, we knew what inspector elements things we're using. And if we needed to find those really, really quickly, we could open up the component search tool, we could type in the script that we wanted to find, and then what that would do is that would give us a list of every object that was using that script. And that would basically give you, again, just efficiency, just a really quick way to find something rather than sometimes having to rely on Unity's search tool, which can take quite a while, and can also just really quickly allow you to pinpoint exact problems that you might need. Animation test scene. Probably for me, because I was doing a lot of the implementation for the vocalizations, this was one of the most important tools that I had in the project, I had access to on the project. It allowed me basically to not worry about the full game scene. I could just open up a quick scene that had a character spawned in there, and I could pick whatever mutant I wanted it to be. I could pick whatever animation that I wanted it to play, and that would allow me to test all of those vocalizations just in a local scene that was in there. So I didn't have to load up the game and wait for a thing to actually be triggered. And like I said, when you're dealing with like 2,000 something voice assets, that's something that saves you quite a lot of time. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. And the audio visual debug tool, which is what we saw before with that label for the waterfall emitter, that basically gave us a 3D printout of the sounds in the world. They would only show up if we were within the distance setting for it as well. And so that allowed us to basically walk around the world and see, like what Mike was saying with the rain, you'd see the rain on the terrain that was playing, you'd see what distance you were at, and it would be respecting volume curves. But as I said, there's lots of sounds in the game, so that got really, really busy. So what we did is we put in an element where we could filter that based on keywords. So if I only wanted to see sounds that deers were making in the game, I could just do filter, audio filter and deer, and any sound that came up that was using the deer path, would basically be the only labels that were showing in that time, which was, again, something that was really just more about saving time and not having to worry about the 300 different labels that were playing at the time. So I'll show you an example of those. This should be the animation test scene. Should be. What have we done today to piss off the tech guys? Yeah. So you can see there I changed the actor type. And all of those elements on the side, that was where I could call up the different type of mutant that I needed, as well as all of the different animations. So you can kind of see how much time that would save you rather than having to go into the main game and see all of those elements there. So the next one should be just the waterfall. So you can see the labels there. And when a bird flies in, you should see a label follow it. And the deer will get creeped out because he probably thinks I'm hungry and he'll run off. So, and again, it's a really, really quick way to be able to test that things are working, testing distance settings in the game as well. So like if you're putting in a waterfall emitter, you want to make sure that that's coming in at the right point, it's fading in nicely, and that allows you to basically see a visual confirmation that that's working as well. Is this you? No? No, that's right. All right. So design challenges. Early access development, even though it gave us quite a lot of time to work on it, was still something that was difficult to work within an extent. So even though I think what End Night Games did with this is they usually stuck to a fortnightly update cycle, which was really, really helpful because it kind of allowed you to plan properly in terms of things that's being thrown into a game because you're working on an early access and it allowing to go through that way. So it allowed you to schedule what you're working, it allowed you to do priorities on items that were going into the next patches. And there were only a few examples where there were like monthly patches, and that was more when we put in the end game content, which I won't talk about because it might spoil stuff, but it's different. But things change really often and really quickly in terms of early access. So you might put in like all these environmental emitters, and then you might, a month later or 2 months later, things might need to change because you're getting information back from the players or they're changing design elements. And like anything, you'd have to iterate on that, and it's probably something that's a bit more common in early access because you've got a larger time frame, or you've got the ability to do that. Like I said, Michael said before, minimal music. Again, nothing against the composers, but it highlighted key elements in there, and it gave like those elements power, but it also meant that the sounds were really at the forefront. And that was a really good design challenge because it meant that you don't have things to hide behind, you don't have things like repetitions will probably be noticed a lot easier because they're not being kind of covered by music and elements like that. So, and again, creating emotion for the player, like music's really important to that. So when you take that out, it kind of leaves this gap. But I think where we did the natural elements of the forest and then you bring in the dissonance of the things like the mutants and the creatures, I think that's where a lot of that horror comes from. And I think we managed to capture that pretty well. Repetitions are more noticeable, and yeah, you require a lot more audio, which is why we got the large number of assets on there. Designing for an open and enclosed environment. So originally, probably for like a good 70% of the project, there was just the forest. And then the end game content got put in there, which is different. So you kind of have to change how you think about how you're designing your sounds. So we had to go back to a more traditional element of like blocking out reverb zones. We used the node emitters to kind of do like sounds going against like pipes and things like that. And so a lot of those tools came in useful again, but you still had to change how you thought about mapping out those elements. And so it was a big change, but it was a really cool challenge. And players spend a lot of time in this game. So there's a lot of videos on YouTube where I think there's a person in Germany where They just make these absolutely incredibly huge structures in there, and they put all their videos on YouTube, and you just sit there just looking at how much time they've put in there, which is really, really cool to see. But at the same time, it's terrifying because they're hearing all of these sounds for those elements, unless they've got like music over it or whatever. But that's another thing to consider as well, because it's an open world game. It's inviting people to play with their friends. It's inviting people to sit there and to craft things, to scavenge for things. So that was an element that you really had to consider when designing your assets and designing the amounts of variations as well. And again, multiplayer. Multiplayer is really hard. So I think the biggest problem we had was sound syncing up, like between hosts and clients. Because a lot of the time, like when the players, you can make traps in the game. So when players are making traps, there's like this build notification sound that goes off. And that is not just local, that's everyone that will hear that. Because again, that's giving information to the other players that someone that's made this massive tree trap that's completed now, so everyone knows that. Whereas the log sled, I think that was probably the worst one of them all. So if you ever use the log sled in the game, in a multiplayer game, and you push it, and you hear like the grinding on the ground, just appreciate the amount of pain that caused us in the game. And if that's the only thing you take from this talk, that will mean the world to me. Yeah, just that log sled. Nightmares. All right. Project challenges and workarounds. So this is, I promised myself that I wouldn't swear when I brought this slide up, but I'm really passionate about this. This isn't me just wanting to get up and yell about the internet in Australia like this. It's crippling, absolutely crippling. And when you're working with remote studios, that we take a lot of pride in the people that we get to work with. And when I show you here on one day what I had to do, it's like we've gone back to the 90s. And it's just one of those things where it really, really is crippling, and it was a huge challenge to work around this at times. And it's just, yeah, like I said, I'm not going to swear. So I think I went on holidays for a little bit, and I came back and I had to pull down the latest updates. And a lot of content and lots of really high resolution textures got put in during them, which was awesome because they looked really good. But it kept failing. So we were using Unity's version control, which they no longer do anymore, but it kept timing out and kept failing. So I had to drive 32 kilometers to Michael's house, copy an up-to-date build, so the entire project, to an external hard drive. So it took about an hour-ish. Drove 32 kilometers back to my house, copy the up-to-date build to a workstation, which is again another hour, import the library, so probably more than that. Made a coffee and have a cry. And that was quicker than to actually pull the build down using Australian internet. And when I see the amount of amazing content that comes out of this country, and I see the studios with the people that are working in this country and what we're able to do, it's incredible that gets done using the shit internet that we have. And that's just something that if you take from this slide, rather than the ranty element of it, but the fact that think about that really early, how you're going to work around that, because it can save you a lot of pain and petrol. Version control, again, we were using Unity's version control, so this slide's probably slightly out of date, and it really struggled to handle the large binary that the game became when it came to the version control. So we couldn't merge, and it would time out a lot when you were pulling down really big updates, but the ways that we came around this is we made audio pathing strings as local to the object that it was related to as possible. So what that means is if you have the player have all of the elements on the player, like the fmod strings, which are basically just like the path to the audio file, as local to the player as possible or on the player prefab. And the reason why that was so helpful is if you were updating the player and someone else was working on all of these other elements, you're just removing the chance of conflict for things like that you're having to do. And prefab-based implementation for ambient emitters. So again, this isn't all groundbreaking stuff, but it's just things that really helped our workflow. And so with the environments, we had, instead of having the Unity scene and just having individual elements in there, we basically had a ambient prefab in there, and that just sat there, and that was what we updated and what we worked from, rather than pulling down the scene, updating the scene, stopping level designers being able to work on the scene, or conflicting with the level designers, or someone that's moved a tree, and we can't kind of get around that. So that was a really big help, because all we had to do is add the emitter, update the prefab, then we send through the prefab, and that updates it in the world space. Communicating what was being worked on, so in terms of both what we're doing based at Kpow, but also keeping an update on what End Night were doing as well, which was just basically, we just had an internal like patch sheet that we were running on, and we made sure we all knew what was happening, and signing off on when things were in there as well, which was really helpful. And in terms of the keyframe and tagging in Unity, more often than not, there were some cases where I'd go through and I'd tag the animations for those voice assets that we were looking at before, and I'd go to update them, and there'd be a conflict, or something would go through, so like, awesome, I have to go do that again. So you really, really quickly learn that you either take a screenshot of what the keyframes were that you had the audio triggering at, because there's nothing worse than getting something feeling really, really good and then having to go back for scratch and doing it, because you'll never get it as good. And that's it. So as we went through the lightning talks before in the morning, this is our way of paying it forward. So anything in there in terms of game audio or game development in general, like if you want to talk about audio elements, that's the way to get in contact with us. As Michael said, Kpow's been around for quite a while, so if there's any way that we can help anyone in terms of game audio or game development, that we can kind of either point people in the right direction or answer questions, that's the way to get in contact with us. So that's it. Thank you.
Do we have time for questions? So you can leave if you want. Any questions, anyone? No.
Are there any significant changes you had to make to the sound design for the VR version or the PlayStation version?
No. I mean, we could have. We didn't really have the time or the resources, but it wasn't absolutely necessary. Yeah. Yes?
With your remote recording of VO, were the animations provided to your talent as reference, or they were working blind?
They were working blind, and we had to significantly edit them to fit. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I think everyone's hungry. I'm hungry.
Excellent.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, hi. Quick question about your physics system. I wanted to know what game parameters you'll be tracking in Ecmos from the game.
Lots of velocity. So I think that the biggest thing for the physics, apart from like, it would be, so you can walk around and, so say the suitcases, for example, you can walk into them and you'll have the impact sound, but also when you're sliding them on the ground, and that was tracking velocity. And that will basically, in Fmod, we'll have that controlling pitch curves and volume curves. So as obviously the velocity increases, pitch would go up. So it would sound like it's kind of moving quicker. So I think generally velocity, was the main one for it. And material types as well was another one. So we used Unity's tagging system quite a bit for like going around in footsteps, like if you're stepping on like glass shards, water, like wood surfaces and things like that. We'd have the tags set up, and then that was all sitting locally on the player. So we'd basically go, okay, they're currently, I think they were raycasting, so they check that you're on a water surface, so we're pushing through water footsteps now.
Just on that same subject, for tracking velocity, is that, are you using the update function to do that? Is that being called every frame? Or is it
So, but it was being switched off when those items weren't being moved as well. So it wasn't like it was constantly doing it. It's only when the element was being interacted with as well. And I think, like, to add on to that, I think that's a really big important thing, is like that just added the feeling of the world being lived in as well. So even though it's a slightly expensive thing to do for that moment of time, it makes a huge difference, because I'm the first person to run around in a game trying to break things and to knock over jars and stuff and be like, oh, it slides, and kind of see if it makes sound. So I think that's something that's definitely worth doing.
With regards to custom tools, who sort of pushes for them to be developed? Is it more like the audio people asking for specific stuff to be made for them, or the programmers asking?
We do. That's something that you don't get to do a lot, but when you do get the chance to, it's awesome. And this was a project that we did. LNY was another one where we got to do that. We kind of got to tell them what we want. It makes a huge difference. Yeah, because you kind of have a pretty good idea of what you want creatively, and then you have to figure out how you can get that using the tools that you have. And if you can't, then you have to make, if you've got the opportunity to make the tools, then you do it.
And just be like, it'll allow us to do things quicker. But yeah, I think particularly for audio tools though, it'll generally come from the audio team, and you have to kind of sit there and justify the amount of time. We were really lucky with Night though, because obviously it's a early access game, so we had a bit more time. So it's probably an outlier example for it, but
And it was successful as well.
Yeah.
So they had money.
yeah. So, but they were open to everything for it in terms of that stuff, because we. They knew that it would bring a higher level of audio polish to the game.
This may be something I could find a YouTube video or something, but I've always not gotten around to assigning sounds to keyframes. What part of the interface do you do there?
It was again, this is an older version, because this was 3-4 years ago, and there's been lots of updates in Unity. But it was using I think it was an asset store tool called Mechanism Event Editor. So basically what that would allow you to do is to create, we had a prefab that handled all of the Mutant keyframes. So we'd open that, and then we would basically just a timeline scrubber that you had in there, and then you would add a new one, point that towards the fmod path or any parameters that you needed, save that, and that was pretty much it. So again, I think that's changed a lot, but I don't think the workflow would be too different now. Everyone can go get lunch. Cool. Thank you.